beginning. We dove into some of the meat of it deeper into 7.4 and skimmed over some of the things that are right in the opening paragraph that are in typical Kenneth Smith writing style. He doesn't signal before he turns left, and he doesn't signal to say, hey, this is the important part here, I'm about to say the important part. He just like tears right through it, and if we miss it, we miss it. And I missed it. So I spent some time digging into it. And if you guys are game, I'd like to excavate a little bit in that first paragraph, because he's pulling all kinds of things together that bear directly on what we were talking about last week, but I didn't know.
Is this 7.4?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Spirit, ego, and art, 7.4. We talked about the opening sentence. We said that one of the ways he contrasts spirit and soul is that spirit is superliminal, whereas soul is subliminal. That what we identify as our consciousness is mostly the development of the conscious layers on top of our early pre-conscious formative layers, and that there's a lot of he's trying to say there is a tremendous amount of soulishness exposed in the live wire infantile experience we're born into, and that there is the development of spirit requires going beyond that. But he says it in ways that are possible to read every which way, and so it's easy to miss the full thrust, the full intent of where he's going.
Well, actually, 7.4 says spirit, ego, and art. Soul
Yes.
is a little different, and I was reading that today. I mean, actually yin yang, but he brought up the spirit and the soul, I think, and art, and so I'll go along with you, but it seems like that there was something very important that might have later answered the question you're asking now on page 113.
Well, we could dive down to 113.
Well, no. Let's go your plan first.
Okay. I mean, this is the thing is, in the previous sections, soul, ego, and art, he's not setting up the full contrast. He's sort of zeroing in on the soulish part. It's not until this one, spirit, ego, and art, where he can finally pit spirit and soul against each other to contrast them with each other and try to see how do they work together and what is their relationship to each other. And of course, during this whole discussion, we're always having to wade through the muck of a lifetime of these words being used in different ways by different people, and not in some one uniform monolithic way that everybody agrees on and Kenneth is disagreeing with, but rather in lots and lots of very poorly defined, vague, and contradictory ways that we just sort of attach ourselves to based on which definitions we prefer, and then feel like we're understanding the conversations because everybody's being amorphous enough that you can't see the points of difference and conflict. But in this essay, he's using these, what do I want to say, Augustinian, Aquinian, Hegelian, classical Greek terms in very precise, specific ways, so that you can't help but disagree with them, because they're clear and crisp enough that for the first time there are things to argue with about, well, is that what we mean by soul or spirit? And so we come back to that core Kenneth Smith idea, which is, well, we're not going to try to tell you what's true or what's real. We're just going to try to describe a perspective as crisply as we can that you could add it to your toolbox and know how to use it and how it works. So right off the bat, in the second clause of the second sentence, he refers to Aufgehoben. And this is what I breezed past last week because I suck, man, because I'm not a professor, I'm a student, I'm still learning. And coming back to it, I see that this is the whole punchline. Because in this one word, he's drawing in all of Hegel's science of logic and Hegel's entire schema of not just Begriff, Verstand, Vernunft, like we've been talking about before, but even the dialectic itself at its core, the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. He's bringing that all in here because Aufgehoben is part of a set of technical terms that Hegel tries to apply to describe the dialectic in his science of logic. And we didn't talk about this term or the terms that are related to it. I've still got more reading to do, But I thought we could unpack this a little bit, because the second half of this paragraph, where he starts talking about Freud and the oceanic feeling, is all a response to Hegel. But I missed that the first time, so I didn't get the whole shape of this. So if you guys are game, I thought it'd be useful to dig into this, because this is really meaty stuff in here. Aufgehoben.
What page are you on now? I want to make sure I'm following you.
This is at the very top of 7.4, Spirit, Ego, and Art. This is the second sentence. The sentence that begins in soulish experiences.
So page 100?
On mine, yes.
Hmm.
It depends on which draft of this you have, because, of course, as we add notes and reformat, the pages move around a little bit.
Yeah. What was the beginning of the sentence again now?
So the opening sentence of 7.4 is spirit, by contrast with soul, is superliminal.
Yeah, okay, that's right. I got that part. But that's actually more seems like a beginning quote or something rather than.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
The second sentence begins in soulish experiences. We lose the articulated and objectified conscious world. But in spiritual experiences, and this goes to Sharon, who keeps asking me every week to clarify soul and spirit. In
That's right.
spiritual experiences, this order is aufgehoben, or incorporated and synthesized up into the spiritual shapes, meanings, or modes of things. And this contrast in this sentence has to be unpacked. This is where the meat is. This is where the whole thing is chewy. So let's dig into it. Aufgehoben is part of a group of terms. The other critical terms are Aufhebung and Aufheben. And I'm going to put these in the chat. And the reason I'm going to do this is every translator of Hegel agrees that these are the most important terms to understanding his dialectic, and yet there is no English equivalent to any of them. In the 19th century, translators ended up inventing terms from Latin. They borrowed and sort of reworked some Latin terms to serve as the translations. And those terms are now widespread in philosophical discussion because there was just nothing like them in English. There was no way to talk about them. So 3 terms here. And he only cites one of them, but the others are obviously here. Aufheben is translated as to sublate. Aufhebung is translated as sublation. And the one he's using here, aufgehoben, is translated as that which is sublated.
Okay, Alf, the AUF, I remember, is something used in the German military to describe alternate versions of a vehicle or a tank or something like that.
Yes. Yes.
So Alf itself, what does it mean? Does it mean something like out or?
So let me pull that up right now.
Yeah, why don't you show your text, because I can't find it. But nonetheless.
I'll show it in just a second. Oh, I want the German. Give me the German. German. On. Auf is on. What the translators say is that the term, yeah, I'll share my screen. What the translators say is that the term, and this is the phrase right here, Phil.
Okay.
The term Aufheben, which this is related to, is just an everyday German term. It doesn't mean anything in particular, except when it's used to discuss German philosophy, and then it's a term of art that has to be understood in a different sense than its everyday sense. And the same is true for Aufhebung and for Aufgehoben.
I can explain this.
Sure, good.
So pretty much from what, I mean, based on the context of this one paragraph, it seems like he's really correlating this with Freud's ego, superego, and id in relationship to, say, using the word soul in relationship to id, of the idea of the undifferentiated consciousness, where it's Aufgehoben, which is able to separate, which is able to cut and put into pieces, sort of like the sword of intellect, let's say, that natural discernment, not of the ego, but of the higher mind, of which he is calling the spirit. or as Freud would call the superego, or all the ancients would call the guardian spirit, or whatever. All these different terminology describe that type of super consciousness that through the natural illumination, let's say, one is able to clearly differentiate details from one another and able to distinguish and being able to take the natural conglomerates of ideas, of phenomena, of objects, and being able to keenly be aware of all the different pieces and parts and how they connect and potentially can disconnect.
So yes, Kenneth is certainly saying that that's how Freud would read Hegel, but Kenneth is also saying that Freud's reading is wrong.
I'm just speaking in regards to him based on this I'm not speaking in regards to, I'm not an expert in Freud, but this whole idea of the subconscious, the conscious, and the superconsciousness, you know, exists in many different systems. And him saying that let's say the Greeks would call the noetic, which, you know, unfairly gets translated as intellect, but in regards to, say, Neoplatonism, this idea of what he's calling the superliminal, that type of effortless awareness of differentiation, as which I was able to look up when it comes down to negate, deny, to negate or eliminate something such as element in dialectic process, but preserved as partial element in its synthesis. Knowing how to take an idea and break it apart, so you're able to see the fundamental pieces that make it up. You're able to distinguish through a type of clarity, a natural clarity that inherently exists. At least that's what I'm guessing that he refers to, and how we then connect to that. It seems like he's coming.
You're guessing, Peter.
Well, this is the ways that he's bringing it about in relationship to the context of how he's describing it. I'm just going through my impression.
Okay, elf in German is used, I know, apparently, with the term model. When they talked about a version of a tank, they were saying a model of a tank, elf. And so elf would mean modality, which is an important concept in philosophy.
Yes, part of what's challenging for us here is that, you know, Hegel's description of the relationship between the different faculties of the mind that we're thinking with is very different from Freud's, and Kenneth is pitting them directly against each other here in order to illustrate kind of what does Freud see and not see in his understanding of the things that Hegel was talking about. And for us, this is an important thing to unpack, because this helps us to see that there's different perspectives on it and figure out how much of our own understanding of our own mind has been swayed one way or another, not through conscious observation and decision making, but just through the assumptions that we've made because of the culture that we're marinating in. And he's trying to move some of those assumptions out of our unconscious and up into our conscious, where we can question them. And he's using Hegel as the lever here. So what Hegel's talking about, that, and this is where Hegel really differs from Kant and from a lot of post-Kantian models of the mind, is that Hegel says that contrary to what Freud would later say, the unconscious isn't actually a primitive version of the conscious. That interpretation of the relationship between the two is, first of all, very non-Hegelian. It's very in keeping with 19th century Great March of Progress to, you know, to Europe being in charge of the world because we're the most advanced and dark-skinned people are the most primitive. There's an enormous amount of unquestioned stuff that's tied up in this idea of a linear march of progress from primitive to advanced that Freud takes for granted in his assumption that the unconscious is crude and gross and animalistic and we need to overcome it. And it might have all the energy, but what we really need is to lift ourselves up to being conscious. And he's got this very Apollonian model, and you can see it when he's talking about, there's this comment down here about Freud remarking on the oceanic feeling and yet not really getting it.
Yes, I wasn't trying to superimpose Freud's narrative to it or necessarily conflate the two.
Yeah, I'm not trying to correct you. I'm trying to, you know, sort of, you got us off to a good start, really digging into the meat of this. So let's dig. So
well, didn't Freud borrow from Schopenhauer?
Yes, and the Greeks and Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think it was Schopenhauer who you know, went from ideas in a very strong to the idea of the will,
Yes.
So the idea of something of being unconscious being the key factor. And of course,
Yeah.
Nietzsche was very much influenced by that idea.
Yes.
I
So
would
why don't, you know, given where you focused the discussion, Peter, why don't we zero in on this part at the center, and we'll work our way back to Aufgehoben. This part of the discussion, the oceanic feeling is a specific quote from a letter that was written by French writer Romain Rolland to Sigmund Freud. They were having a discussion, and Rolland was critiquing what Freud had done so far early in his career and was saying, this is all very interesting, but I'd like to hear you talk about the oceanic feeling, which underlies all religion, that feeling of unity merging with the whole that people report across all different religions. And kind of what is that? How does that fit into your model? And Freud responded a bit, but then he incorporated that discussion into the end of his book, The Future of an Illusion, and into the beginning of his book, Civilization and Its Discontents. And what he did in that discussion was essentially a response to Roland's question. What is this oceanic feeling that we see underlying religion? And how does it fit into your schema? And Freud's response was, well, that's the primitive stuff we have to overcome, right? It's subjective, it's the feeling life. You can't really pin it down very well. You can't really reason about it. It doesn't lend itself to logic. And so in order to grow up, we have to get out of that and move into being rationalists.
Mm-hmm.
And in saying that, he's saying what the entire modern epoch is based on, is this notion that if we are just Apollonian enough, if we're just rational and logical and thoughtful enough, then, you know, great things will follow and we'll solve all our problems. And this is, of course, before the 20th century. He hasn't seen where that leads with the Germans and the Holocaust. But even if he had, like a lot of people today, he would probably still want to push back and say, well, that wasn't rationalism. That was a betrayal of rationalism. That's because of their emotional, subjective prejudices. But if we could all just be rational, nothing like that would ever happen again. Failing to see the direct connection between the liabilities and limits of reason and the kinds of catastrophes that can only be
I've got some bad news for him. Humans are made of meat.
Well, yes, right. This obviously bothered Freud a great deal.
This rationality reason balloon is connected to the human meat.
Yes, yes.
Well, what I get from this is there's a big difference between the synthetic and synthesis.
Yes.
Because the synthetic is merely connecting what is conscious, all the pieces, putting it together to create a new whole, but they're incomplete. Whereas synthesis is an attempt to reach down into the unconscious and connect that to the conscious, which is completely different, because you're dipping into the ocean. Let's put it that way, rather than merely, thinking the ocean is sort of pretty much nothing, because it's you can't see it, which is what I brought up Bruckner about. Therefore, the spirit is the thing that creates the synthetic thing that could advance the synthetic project, which consciousness is about, right? So therefore, to really be productive, you have to connect to the deep ocean of the unconscious and make that connection, which is a connection of depth rather than a mere surface connection. That's the way I get that distinction.
Right. Yeah, and that's what this paragraph is all about. Is it's trying to engage with the fact that Freud, like most of us, as a modern, in fact, as an ultra modern, because Freud is one of our demigods of modernism, right? He's trying to reason his way to a solution of the human problem, and he is highly skeptical of anything that's too subjective, as being just all murky and uncertain. And so when he offers us his triumvirate of id, ego, and superego, he's doing it through a Verstand interpretation, because he's a very Verstand guy. He's very noetic. He's analyzing these things noetically, and he's assuming that you can get to a complete, proper understanding of how the human mind works from a strictly noetic perspective. And as such, he has an enormous amount of scorn for the id. He's willing to grant its due that it might have the energy and that you can't suppress things and you have to analyze them and figure out what they are. But he believes that, the real perfect life is going to involve lifting ourselves up out of that beastly animalistic existence to what he sees as the higher, more important faculties. And
so if you use Freud's analogy, it's like it's only now that we begin to understand that beneath the ocean there are many structures that
yes,
is not just a murky,
yes,
melted together bunch of amoebas. It's
yeah,
really a very complex structure as
yeah,
well. So there are structures within something that we do not know as yet that we will discover and get connected to it. So I think that's true. And if indeed, I guess using another metaphor, if what's above the water is really just the tip of the iceberg, there's a lot of stuff down there and they have structures as well. And you need to dive down in order to see those structures rather than say, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff down there. Who knows until the Titanic crash into it. So there you
right.
go.
I'm gonna pause for a metaphor here because I think one of the most important things about understanding Freud is the way in which, on the one hand, he so usefully cataloged all these defense mechanisms that we use, like projection and compartmentalization and so forth. And once you learn what they are and you look at your own life, you see them doing them all the time. And you look around in politics and culture at large and everybody else is doing them. You're like, okay, these things needed names. They needed to be cataloged. Thank you, Freud. This was an incredible contribution. But this is the same guy who, when he was interviewing women and they told their stories about how they were raped and abused by their own male relatives, he thought, well, we're an enlightened civilization, so obviously that's not true. Those things can't actually be happening. So these must be fantasies, and these women just are, they're envious of their parents' penises, and they want to be honorary men. And so he invented this whole schema of psychological desires in women entirely as a strategy for him to not look straight at the reality of his times and the kinds of abusive relationships that were all around him in the people that he trusted and that he worked with. He couldn't deal with the truth, and so he hammered it into a shape he was more comfortable with. And in doing that, he wasn't betraying rationalism. He wasn't doing an irrational thing. He was engaging in a purely, perfectly rational operation. Hegel could perfectly describe how that happened, but Freud couldn't, because he had all the virtue associated with reason and all the vice associated with emotion and the id. And so there was no room to understand what he was doing in those terms. This capacity for reason to be ungrounded from the truth, to be ungrounded from the rich constraints of nature and its lawfulness, to be able to speculate any coherent system it likes and seize upon it and use it as a replacement for the truth, as a set of glasses that filter out all the things we don't want to see. This is reason functioning at 100% in its pure, perfect capacity. Reason wants to take credit for being realistic, but realism is not any part of rationality. Rationality is about logic, so it's about validity, not truth. And its desire to equate the two and say that what I can prove is valid must ergo ipso facto be true is one of the deep Achilles, it's one of the deep flaws. It's the core Achilles heel of reason itself. It's what Hegel so beautifully critiques in his analysis of Verstand and the way that noesis is vulnerable to being convinced by its own systematic coherence. And it wants to embrace that and say, because I'm systematically coherent, I must be right. And it's then failing to understand that it's all that messy stuff that it wants to do away with. Tradition, emotions, sensations, that's the realm that reality lives in. And because it wants to unground itself from that, it also makes itself unable to tell the truth. It's only able to tell what's valid and mathematically beautiful. So what he's doing here in this opening paragraph is he's comparing and contrasting the way that Hegel looks right at these issues. Now, Hegel is an ultra-rationalist too, but he's in reaction against Kant. And as a rationalist reacting against Kant, he said, I'm going to be a rationalist who understands things beyond reason and tries to map them out and see them for what they're worth.
Could I let me add another thing to it, because I mentioned in a different meeting, I mentioned it here as well, that there was a guy named Anaxagoras, who was part of the camp of Pythagoras. That's right, Pythagoras. And he says, there is limited and unlimited. And but he forgot it. Well, he didn't mention the third class, which is the unlimited, that's beyond the known. He says, since we have mathematics which can describe reality, such as Pythagoras was able to do, but there are still what's left that we do not have the mathematics for, and so therefore it remains in the unlimited for now. But in fact, maybe later on we will discover a more complex and more encompassing mathematics that would expand our understanding of the unlimited. But he forgot that there might be other things that cannot be described in a mathematical equation, such as things that has quality, and that's also part of the unlimited. And so even here, even if you took it to the level of Anaxagoras, it would still be restricted to a kind of conscious understanding through a system of language and mathematical structures, but that still would be still limited.
Right. Right.
If you don't mind, my I suppose I'm feeling a bit inspired, if I may, to interject.
Please.
Just a little of a book that I read recently, and I think it's appropriate enough, and I want to introduce it as an idea.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This idea that to think without feeling is just as pathological as feeling without thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right on the money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Hegel's core argument in his Phenomenology of Geist. He says, we've got these two fundamental baseline metabolic mental faculties that our minds are based upon. But in the modern world, we're taught that one of them is gross and disgusting and primitive, and that the other one is advanced and beautiful and will lead to all goodness and truth. And you see that in Freud's dismissal of the oceanic feeling. And you see it also in the way that we discuss the dichotomy in the mind as being between thinking and feeling. But what Hegel says is that they're both forms of thinking. It's with the tendency of the form of thinking that's dominant in the modern era is to disregard the other one as incapable of structured thought.
If you don't mind, sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Even though I don't mean to take away from Hegel, I still want to, if I may, complement this idea as feeling this type of thinking as more looking at it as a false dichotomy, in that it is a spectrum in regards to what is, say, let's say water and an ice and an isotope, and it comes down to something more amorphous versus something more specific in regards to how sensation can translate on a spectrum. From being a more oceanic feeling towards being a more of a clear concept, that it's not just of two different sides. It's one thing in different shapes. Just like, I guess, using the water ice metaphor, that sense of every single thought in your mind, as a shape. It has color, the color of feeling. You cannot have shape without color or color without shape. It's just feelings tend to be more amorphous, right? They tend to be more vague. They tend to be more of a complex and less specific, where thoughts, even if they're not necessarily complex, they have their what we notice of them as less of their color and more of their definition. And so how do we experience inside ourselves all the different phenomena and layers that exist within our mind? In my opinion, the benefit of that model of looking at it not as a type of ontological categorization of different types of thinking or feeling, not making either one necessarily predominant, but looking at, if I may say, the natural alchemical process of how we translate the different sensations within us into bodily, emotional, thoughtful, or of in regards to soulful, or of spiritual in this context. How do we play with those ideas rather than find some type of definitive system?
Right. So the point of the exercise is to to add some tools to the toolbox, to add some perspectives to the way we see the world. And we want to get each one as in focus as we can in terms of the way that it sees things, so that we can compare and contrast them with each other to try to triangulate on reality. And so that's kind of what he's doing here, is he's setting up, the Freudian perspective is one that we more take for granted without understanding it, because it's so permeated our culture. We marinate in it before we're even thinking. Before we're making decisions about how we want to approach the world, we're already soaking in it. Whereas the Hegelian has really been excluded from popular culture. We do not see the world that way naturally, unless we struggle through the culture bubble that we are born into, as Stephen talked about, unless we push through to try to construct that additional perspective. And then what Kenneth Smith says is not that we should throw away the one we have and replace it with Hegelianism, but rather what we want is we want two perspectives. We want the perspective we had and Hegelianism, and then we can look at each situation and figure out who has what to say about each situation. So what he's trying to do is bring the Hegelian perspective into clearer focus. And that's pretty important to do here, because the translations are horrible. I mean, just horrible. All the very best translations there are of Hegel into English are just dreadful. And the reason is that many of the core terms don't exist in English in any form. There is no English word that's the equivalent. And the insistence on treating English like a Procrustean bed that we're going to hammer Hegel's ideas into, whether they fit or not, results in gibberish sentences that are just, not only are they incomprehensible in English, but they're also betrayal of the original meaning in German. And so what we're trying to do here a little bit is bring in a handful of terms intact from German and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to supplement English, and we're going to add a handful of terms so that when we mean this particular thing from Hegel's philosophy, everybody will know that we're not talking about something else, because we're using that term. We're not trying to talk about the notion versus the concept, or the other kinds of gibberish that you typically get in a Hegel translation into English. So the point of this is that oceanic feeling that Roland and Freud are talking about, Hegel says goes far beyond just being an emotion. The idea that what's going on in that faculty is merely feelings, however rich or complex, is itself a Freudian assumption. It's a modernist assumption. And it causes us to misunderstand the structure of our own mind and what it's doing. Hegel says that these two faculties have different strengths and weaknesses. And the thing that Freud embraces and loves, the reason, the rationality that he admires, it has this great analytical power. It's able to chop things into pieces and look at their parts. But it is allergic to synthesis. The very power, the very obsession with finding the components and trying to reduce all meaning to being mathematical combinations of components, in and of itself presupposes that the Verstand perspective on the world is true, which is a mistake, because it takes multiple perspectives to see the truth. If we embrace any one single perspective and say that's the truth as it actually is, it guarantees that we're going to miss everything you can't see from that angle. And this is the weakness of modernism, is that we so embrace Verstand and we accept its assumption that breaking things into parts is how you get at the truth.
I just want to make one terminological type of distinction that
Sure.
in regards to that part of the mind that is allergic to synthesis. That part I would call the English word intellect. I would not claim it to be the noetic of the ancient Platonists. To me, therein lies one of the great misunderstandings, in my opinion, of this concept of the intellect, of that which only can divide.
Yeah, it's tricky with the Greeks because their terms gnosis and noesis, phasis, all the other terms they have, techne, they use them in different ways at different times. So it always depends on which writer you're reading and what argument they were having as to how they use these terms.
I suppose Iamblichus is the school of thought of which I'm most primarily acquainted with, and his school of things.
Right. We've been using gnosis and noesis differently, but it doesn't really matter which way, because you can take it from different schools and use it different ways. But we can use the Hegelianism here to help us. He uses the term, well, okay, so one thing that Kenneth Smith argues about this is that what we see in the primitive basal metabolism of the mind, the way that gnosis and noesis are used by the baseline capabilities, do not fully express the capabilities of gnosis or noesis. They're both capable of more than the way they're typically used under modernism. And so he argues in favor of using of mapping the Hegelian terms onto the Greek terms in order to help illustrate, what's the difference between primitive noesis, limited finitizing, self-enclosing noesis, versus a mature adult noesis that allows it to infinitize. And the same with gnosis. What's the difference between an infantile, primitive, self-enclosing form of gnosis versus a fully realized adult infinitizing form of gnosis? That these capacities reach beyond the ways that we use them.
I think you can't just blame modernism for this.
No.
Modernism has intensified that struggle, but it really extends all the way back to civilization when you split the stone. In other words, it seems to me the ability to divide and then the ability to, in a sense, create a language that suits a kind of analytical thinking has thousands of years history. Matter of fact, if you look at the intellectual history, at the bottom of it is really based on logic and mathematics. And so therefore that structure has built, well, I hate to call it the Tower of Babel, but has built a structure that's so compelling that and force you to argue in the sense of that structure that is very, very difficult, especially with the exclusion of the middle, right? In other words, the middle is taken out. So therefore, in a sense, as soon as you put in the middle, you exclude it from the discussion because you're obviously out of your mind.
Right.
So therefore, like, just go somewhere else, talk to your own tribe. We don't need you. We don't want you. Like, this is blasphemy. So therefore, in a sense, it's even very hard because quite often, when you talk about Hegel, and I don't know enough about Hegel, but it's almost like people just say, has a complaint primarily like, he seems incomprehensible. We don't know what the hell he's talking about, right? So therefore, in a sense, like, maybe he's just one step from the insane asylum, but like, it just doesn't make any sense. We can't even see what it is about. And so therefore, in a sense, they've excluded that just by default. They can't understand it, right? But they do, in a sense, criticize what they can't understand.
Right.
That's the problem.
Right. What we do is we encounter it. We see the words that are used in the translation. We object to what we think they're saying, and then we accuse Hegel of being the stupid caricature we've just drawn of him in our own minds based on what we read. And that's why this is sort of an important exercise to try to push through the translation and get back to what is he trying to say about the structure of the mind, and how does that differ from the sort of assumptions we typically have? And go ahead.
Sorry, I think to bring it back to this idea of the mythos, to me, I feel that a lot of, as in your question before, rhetorically said or not, in regards to the mature perspective of being able to entertain many different perspectives, languages, semantical orientations, that in order to do that, we need to look at, in my opinion, one of the central enemies is the appeal to reductionism, the idea of trying to find some type of core conceptual framework of which we base our identity and outlook on, instead of, and I think that it's that priority that makes us resistive or rejective of being able to hold multiple simultaneously, because there's that tendency of wanting to favor one necessarily over the others in some type of absolutism as opposed to contextually. And so it is through our exposure to myths, to metaphors, that we're able to expand our imagination and conceptual entertainment in regards to how other people use different words, let alone how they're translated from other languages.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's at the core of Kenneth Smith's philosophy. We should be studying radically different perspectives on the world and getting to understand them not in our terms but in their own terms. And then we should practice we should practice dislocating the joint of our mind to be able to look at it from the different perspectives we've collected. And what'll happen as a result of that is that we learn to be less defensive about protecting our own one perspective that we think is the solitary source of truth, and we gain the ability to start opening ourselves to other sources of insight.
That beginning part of what you said is where I vehemently disagree when it comes down to detaching about, yes, we need to be aware of our own biases, of our own favoritism, of the pushes and pulls of what we like and versus dislike. It's definitely important in regards to being aware of it, but trying to disassociate the intellect from our very feelings / biases I feel is sort of what causes the problem. It's trying to go to this false purity of objectivism, which I'm not saying doesn't have its place. It of course does. And I really want to, write that in stone here. But I still think without contextually putting it in regards to its value, we tend to that much more numb our ability to become aware of things that we deem irrelevant. Instead of trying to actually look at the whole picture, we hyper focus our minds into missing things that would otherwise be valued in other languages or systems. And I think it's that tendency that leads us to these blinders that we chronically develop in philosophy and consideration, that we each develop our own unique blinders, right? But we lose the ability to take them off because we're so focused on this purity of objectivism.
That's right. I'm going to call on Dale in a moment, but before I do, I want to say, I know you think we're disagreeing, but I actually agree with everything you just said. That the whole point of this is in fact to get the blinders off, not out of a mistaken belief that what will result is that we will see the truth as it actually is, but so that we're drawing on more information, including our feeling life, including our intuition, including the dreams and the early memories and all the things that we've been suppressing because modernism teaches us that they're worthless and that only science and laws and rules and things like that matter. So I'm actually with you, even if it sounds like I'm not. We'll circle back to that in a moment. Dale and then Phil, go ahead.
Okay, so I know that the neuroscience is not the favorite of this group, but
love it.
Both the implicit mental biases spoken of by the neuroscientists and the diversity used by industry are in pursuit of injecting new ideas, of not being blinded by your own implicit biases, but by having people who think differently from you within your thought space so they can call you on it, or like what I have most experience with in engineering, go, I see a solution that you don't see yet. And then everybody throwing their thinking into the pot. With an engineering mindset, there is no one correct answer.
Right.
Right. So this really resonates with me. Thanks.
Oh, glad to hear you say that. Yeah, kind of the core insight that underlies all this is an ancient Greek recognition that compared to human existence, the truth about nature is infinite. The cosmos is too big to explore. Even one continent is too big to explore. You could travel your whole life and not really ever get the whole of it. And that what we have here is a mismatch between the finitude of human life and the infinitude of the truth that we're trying to represent. And so
go down this path, there's a risk you might think you've found God.
Yes. Yes.
I think that's what right. They did, didn't they? They were finding God down there.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, and we all have our idols.
Yes, but
no. You're not the God of idols, not the rational idols. This is a God which is found in the feeling.
I'm talking. I mean idolatry. I mean thinking that's to saying something is more God versus less God. Something that where if you point, if you can apply your mind to something, object or subject or whatever, that you feel is more than less. And to me, therein lies the aspect of that type of, well, in my opinion, structure of idolatry. You feel that a particular state of mind or something you can focus on is more connected to God than otherwise. And that then defines your value system, does it not? Whether you call God, it doesn't matter. It's what you find to be beautiful and true or whatever. What you find inherently attractive and of what you fixate on.
Yeah, I'd say, picture a medieval monk that in a sense, they're going through a version of this experience, if they're successful.
Right. what they're struggling for, right?
Yeah, they haven't got fortunately for them, their Verstehen is simpler.
Right.
So it's easy to meet God in there. There isn't our sort of a more expanded perspective that doubts God. It's easy for them within their framework. Say, well, there's a world here. Obviously, God created it, so let's get cracking.
Yeah. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it has something to do with the burden of our history in this sense. I was in a group that looked at the documentaries of Joseph Bronowski. I highly recommend that series. I think it is very, very important. But from the beginning, I had objections.
Yeah.
Not objections that he was saying certain things, but he seemed to exclude other things. I remember the first objection I made was when he was talking about man creating things, like what he did was show that there was a couple ways you could make things. One is with your hands, and it turns out the round shapes that was made was more natural to the hand product in that sense. But then, but somewhere along the line, probably before that, but somewhere along the line, the splitting of the stone was more efficient in that particular point in history, because I wonder, on the one hand, how man would survive in a nature if he just made round objects that was more an extension of nature that's naturally processed, because the weapon, the splitting of stone, allow you to survive and in a sense separate yourself from nature, because that was a survival skill. Unfortunately, we continue to push that notion because we became more and more efficient toward creating this external shell structure. So I continue to have minor objections, not that I objected the whole thing. This was the thing that carried the sin of man until we finally got to a point where the splitting of things, the categorization of ideas in that sense became so dominant, it was difficult, except through the counterproduction of the arts that produces another point of view. But now it turns out that even that point of view is going to be sunk under the water, so it's going to be totalized in the production of categories of the synthetic product, whether the synthesis. And I just wonder whether I'm not blaming the splitting of the stone, but it is time for us to grow up and expand this other dimension that we've left behind as sort of like a minor thing. We'll just let you have that, right. Like as long as it doesn't really disturb the straight line progression, ascent of the culture to a ever more efficient structure. So right. I think when Hegel wrote that, he must have felt that it was a desperate enough time to critique the system in a sense, because he found that there was still the spirit left in the production of this other point of view, but it was disappearing, as it points out. Poetry was very, very important, and now we see it as like that's okay as a private thing. It's rather childish, for you to do that. And we all indulge in some poetry when we were young to a certain degree, but we gave it up because we need to be productive machine. So therefore, I think maybe it's time we finally begin to grow up. And I'm glad to see environmental science is finally making somewhat of a breakthrough, in a sense, to go beyond the productive model that we have for nature of containing it rather than letting it expand in its own right. So it might be, unfortunately, it might be too late. So that's the problem, is that we forgot that this other part, that's a very important part to make us complete and be in harmony with nature, as well as beyond just conquering it.
So, he talks about this here. He's saying that, our connection to gnosis may be detached. We may live extremely Verstand lives, but it doesn't change the fact that our brain is still producing these experiences. It remembers the infantile life. That infantile life haunts us. We long for that feeling of connectedness and being part of a larger whole, and not just to what's outside of us, but also, as Heraclitus says, to what's inside of us. We long to not be disconnected from our own sense of meaning. And why
I'm not so sure because yes, we long for that, but I wonder if the current generation, would they rather have that infantile feeling of longing to experience nature, or would they rather have an iPod? Tell me. I mean, they're longing for the iPod, and so therefore, in a sense, even if that exposes you to the world, you go see different cultures and all that, you nonetheless are wrapped up in the technology of production rather than than experience. So I'm not so sure because that's already screening you in a world that is pre-digested so that you are experiencing a synthetic world rather than a synthesis. So you answer me, what do they long for? Because I think even in my generation, we still long for that. But now I think everybody wants the iPod, or some facsimile of that.
Well, does the nature actually have to be like, trees and rocks nature? Because the reason I'm asking is my kids use technology for communication a lot, and they use it for playing epic games a lot, both with themselves and with each other. And isn't playing an epic game sort of getting back to, primitive things, or am I crossing the streams here?
Well, certainly part of the appeal of games like that is that they offer you a temporary escape out of the sterility of the modernist life. That's where I'm talking about the longing. So everybody feels the discontents. Everybody feels the anxiety and the stress of the way that we live right now, which is hyper Verstand, hyper Apollonian. It's not ultimately satisfying. It may be distracting, and it may be very profitable, and it has its advantages, but it's incomplete.
It's a spiritual desert.
It's a spiritual desert, yes, and it's why so many people who end up with enormous amounts of money and are highly successful nevertheless commit suicide. They do drugs. Or they walk away from it all, because if the promise of modernist life were true, when you had won, you should feel whole and happy and complete. And instead, frequently we win and then we feel empty because we're like, is this it? This is what how much did I sacrifice? I wasn't there for my parents on my parents' deathbed. I gave up children's birthdays, and here I am, and I'm standing at the finish line, and I'm like, this is what I fought for? It's fun along the way as a distraction to burn up some time, but ultimately it doesn't connect you with the larger whole and make you feel like your life is worth meaning. And Hegel can tell us why that is. And this is what's interesting about his perspective.
I personally would, in regards to Phil's question, bring it down to Epicurean hedonism, as a fundamental metaphoric base of motivation about what will bring the deepest satisfaction the longest in regards to what we go after and what we believe will scratch that itch, or will fill up that hole, or release whatever that natural fundamental compulsion we all have towards trying to get what we want, and how we develop what that means in regards to, let's say, longevity of I can, eat this candy bar every day, but I'm going to get fat, and that's going to increase, I'm eventually going to weigh that the hedonism, the short pleasure I get isn't worth the deeper long-term pain. To me, hedonism, in regards to how we look at what is worth striving for, is really heavily dependent on how far we're aware of the consequences of our actions. in regards to where we ultimately want to go and how do we move in that direction compared to what we would consider, depending on different people, distractions, things that satisfy us only so far or for only so long. How do we move from wherever that is where we are to something that is a bit more fulfilling?
Yeah, and that's
Okay, you're pushing your trolley through the spiritual supermarket, are you, Peter? Have you
I don't
found
know what that
anything
means.
interesting?
Oh, yeah. I spent 6 months in India. I've been in ashrams and
Going along those shelves. Oh, there's a packet of soup. I'll put that in the trolley. Oh, there's another one. Beautiful.
I've been a
Go to the checkout.
spiritual dilettante for a long while, but I'm pretty satisfied with where I'm going at the moment. We'll see where it goes.
so part of why I wanted to dig into this paragraph this morning, I guess it's afternoon now, is because I realized not just that I'd missed some of the import of it, which we can finish unpacking, in a little bit, but also because that import made me realize that I had not fully understood the way that he's using the term spirit and spiritual. And since that's one of the things we've been trying to tease out over the course of these sessions, I thought it was pretty important to come back to it and say, well, what do I think I've got wrong here? What have I missed? What have I misunderstood? See if I could be helpful with that. So one of the things about this oceanic feeling in particular that Freud dismisses is that it's not just a feeling. He calls it a feeling, and Roland calls it a feeling because they're coming from a Verstand perspective. And Roland is writing because he's skeptical about whether the Verstand perspective is complete. He thinks it might be missing something. And he's impressed by Freud's ability to seemingly categorize everything that people do with their minds. And he wants to see if Freud can handle this too. Is there some way that this is Freud's Verstand so impressive that it can account for this as well? But ultimately what Freud does instead of accounting for it is dismiss it. And the reason that he dismisses it is because this is the key blind spot of Verstand. The thing that Verstand can't do is form wholes. It can form machines of parts, systematic, rational, logical collections of pieces that move in great Rube Goldberg kind of assemblages that it thinks are wholes because it doesn't understand there's anything beyond a mechanistic level of organization to the cosmos. And that's because it's finitizing. Verstand is finitizing. And so it can't accept the possibility of anything infinite. So anything infinite has to be recast as a bunch of finite pieces that if you put them together in the right way and press the button, they go and you win, the end. Right? That's
the reason Donald Trump sent them haywire.
Yes.
The rationalists freaked out. Donald Trump, who wasn't a great rationalist, was a man who was in some feeble way in contact with his will.
Yes.
And proceeded out of that.
Yes.
And the legions of rationalists just went Burko.
Yes. Yes. And the critique that you're giving is one that people are so polarized by the consequences of the Trump administration that they're largely unable to look at that detail that you're pointing out. And it's an important detail because it goes right to the heart of this paragraph, which is that you can be a good person or you can be a bad person and you can still be doing Verstand. But as long as you're doing Verstand, you're going to have these blind spots, regardless of whether you're a good person or a bad person. And it's because Verstand can't do this thing. This oceanic feeling goes far beyond being a feeling. It's part of the structure of thought of Begriff. It's what we're born into when we're born. And it's not something to overcome and leave behind. And that's where Freud differs from Hegel. And that's where Aufgehoben and the other terms come into play here. Because like most modernists, Freud thinks that primitive things are bad and you have to either destroy them or enslave them. One or the other. They must not be allowed to rule, and they must not be allowed to be equals. They must be subordinated or destroyed. And that's the relationship between the advanced and the primitive from a modernist perspective. It's all he can conceive. And since he can see the oceanic feeling being tied to the infantile life, and because he's terrified of the irrationality and loss of control of the infantile life, he shoves down this oceanic quality he tries to reduce it to being a mere feeling, a mere fact, a non-rational subjective datum. That he's then going to just incorporate as something to be overcome. And in doing that, he's made the fundamental blunder that all Verstand people do, which is not understanding that there's such a thing as synthesis, not understanding that there's more to the world than a bunch of pieces assembled into a machine, not understanding that there is in us, evolution has developed in us, an entire half of our mind that is exquisitely tailored to be able to become very, very good at this mode of thought that involves oceanic feelings, but that Freud is terrified of, because he doesn't think that's thinking at all. He doesn't understand that being able to see the connections that put you together into a larger whole is a form of thinking. That we call it feeling. We call it intuition, we call it memory, we call it sensation. We divide it up into all these little parts and treat them all as separate things, but they're part of the whole system of gnosis. And there's a lot more to gnosis than what we allow it to express in the modern order. Under the modern order, gnosis has to be stamped down into this trivialized begriff format that's as close as possible to the infantile experience, so that it won't challenge the structures and systems that Verstand has constructed.
For me, one way of complementing that aspect of that characterization of Freud, I believe one of the great benefits and issues of psychoanalysis is that it's so long as you have some type of coherent system, some type of something the intellect can uphold, even if it's complete bullshit, it creates some type of stability for the ego. So long as you have a collection of answers. And that's what, psychoanalysis offered. It allowed for all these people that were floating around in all of these different types of imagery and narratives. Psychoanalysis offered them a system in which to attach to in order to orient themselves to the social world. However true or not, it's irrelevant. But that's what religions have done throughout time, is offer different answers to all the different parts of reality, of which, come with questions, so that there is some type of stability, however rigid, in regards to role, identity, and society as a whole. And I feel that personally, it is with that type of natural tendency, again, that temptation towards the coherent, it's easy to, I think, mistake this idea of the difference between the rational and the irrational, is that there is a whole range of middle ground of things, in my opinion, that do not really count as necessarily coherent, but yet, it's not random. And I feel that it's easy to misassociate the irrational with random, as opposed to all the different ways that we can relate to, let's say, metaphysics, all the different metaphysical systems that are not rational, but nor are they random. And therein lies are being able to entertain thoughts that are not base, but yet not based on logic. And I think therein lies we get to expand on getting some type of clarity and relationship to the parts of our mind and ourselves that would be otherwise be deemed as, oh, you're beastly compulsions, go away with you from my effortful, of a pursuit towards clarity.
Polluting my pure intellect with your ickiness. Yes, no, I'm with you. And the argument that Kenneth Smith makes and that Hegel makes is that irrational side, which we call irrational specifically because we assign all the goodness to rationality, and we're saying this is all therefore the badness, because it fails the test of rationality, and therefore it must all be bad. And wouldn't it be nice if we could be Vulcans and get rid of it? But the problem is that represents Verstand's fundamental misunderstanding of how the human mind works, that leads it to be incapable of understanding how it is that Verstand systems can lead to chaos and destruction. because
Well, this was a thing with Nietzsche. His fellow scholars wanted to burn him
right, right,
on this grounds, wasn't it?
on this ground. Yeah,
Well-
you're right. Right, because Nietzsche embraced this stuff and started dancing around with it and mocking Verstappen, and it just everybody hated it because he was making them all feel bad feelings, and they wanted to say, "Well, you're wrong because of the following reasons that I've assembled," none of which ever went to the core of Nietzsche's philosophy, but all made perfect sense from a Verstappen perspective why they would be upset. So part of what Kenneth Smith and Hegel are trying to do here is to get us to reinterpret the irrational mind as something on its own, not merely as being the antithesis of the rational mind, but instead as being a thesis of its own that is full of not only capabilities, but capabilities we actually can't live without, that are desperately important, that there's a reason why evolution developed these capabilities in us, because without them, we're doomed. We need them.
I fear that even though, however beautiful that is, it's still a bit too abstract. I think, in my opinion, my reflection in trying to convey this idea is this idea of grounding out in a practical application. And to me, one of the most obvious is being able to read, being able to assign meaning to a form, to the alphabet, that is not inherently connected. The sound that we put to these squiggles is something we made up.
Yeah.
And yet, through that system, there's no inherent logic that goes with A. That's just something we decided long ago and decided to collectively agree upon, that those meanings are associated. It's completely arbitrary. But through that arbitrariness, we develop brilliant systems.
Right.
And it's about that fundamental creativity outside of the logical connections that I feel that people are think that their mind will dissolve if they actually start playing with associations outside of what the culture deems significant.
Right.
You know?
Right. Verstand ultimately leads to a certain kind of terror of most of the things that matter in life. It is not noesis in its richest form. It's noesis in a stunted, kind of constrained form, in which it's not ever going to flower into what we need it to become. But we'll come back to that. Phil's got his hand up, so go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, to me, it seems like that there's two problems. One is that since language has developed in such a way that has to do with utility, and it was captured in a kind of production logic, it seems like it has developed much more nuance within it in terms of like creating multiple categories or differentiation. So therefore, we're trapped in this system of dividedness about relationships. So that's one thing, is like, it seems to me, for you to get into that, you have to like find yourself a room, a niche within that system, for you to even entertain the idea of being in that system to argue for the other thing. Okay, number one. And because because language has that favoritism, in a sense, partly through history and partly through its kind of productive potential, that it has, in a sense, captivated and sort of diminished the development of another language that could speak in a equal term. So they have an advantage in that sense, because now you have to play their game. It's the only game in town, so to speak. The other thing is, I kind of quibble with you about the diversity of what's under the ocean, of the illogic, unknowable. I think there are distinctions, there are divisions, but if you use the ocean as a metaphor, it's also a much freer zone that's about interconnectedness as well. So therefore, feelings has more difficulty in terms of creating structures of differentiation between them, because they melt into each other in a much more sort of like gentle kind of a transitional way between one feeling and another. Quite often, even when I feel pain and pleasure, those seem very contrary. But sometimes I realize, certain pains in a certain condition ends up being pleasure. And so you
Right.
wonder, like, wait a minute, like they're supposed to be contradictory, but
Right.
in fact, there is a kind of unity that's built within it. And the metaphor I would use is that the intellect of rationality has created a McMansion with multiple rooms
Yes.
that you could live in and distinguish yourself from other disciplines. But feelings, in some sense, is a loft. You get a loft, and there are many things going on, and they seem to coordinate with each other, but they're not quite as separate that you could cut it into rooms. It's like, pleasure here, pain there, like whatever, it's more interconnected. And so therefore, I hate to also think that we will develop another language for feelings, for this deep emotion that in a sense cut each feeling away from each other in some sense, because we have to be able to think of another structure that allows more permeability between the different things, even if you want to separate it. And that's part of the problem, is that we can't distinguish one from the other because it flows into like a modulation flow into each other. So I think that's the part I disagree with you, is that structure cannot be as, how should I say, apparently articulated as it should be. As we think we might want to, because that would be a mere a representation of the other structure, but we must invent a different architecture that allows for free flow as well, because that's what feelings are. And when you have that, then people say, well, no wonder you're all muddled. You're all in the same fucking room.
That's not allowed.
Rather than like distinguish yourself.
You guys just cannot stop rationalizing it all. You're living with the rational. You're fighting against what's being expressed here. You don't want to know it.
Yeah, that's because I don't want to play your fucking game.
If I may, to me, one metaphor that I find really keen to this topic is the rainbow. How do you distinguish between what is red and what is orange, for example? Where do you draw the line? In many ways, the line is arbitrary, but the more you move towards one, the more is like, okay, this is not really red anymore. Okay.
Right.
It's not really orange. Yeah, there are so many ways where you could cut it because there isn't an inherent way we can distinguish it. Now, some philosophies say, well, there has to be a line somewhere, and I'm going to defend to the death where this line is. Other philosophies say, well, I guess there really isn't a true red or true orange because there's no distinguishing between them. They're just all one color. And I think that both of those are, two opposite extremes to the nature of the phenomena. That you can cut it in different places and you can make an argument. But I'm going to vehemently disagree with you. You can call an apple orange. You're going to call blood orange. Because it's all about how far within, besides the language of society, the different languages that we come in contest of where they divvy the line. To me, the question is, how can we honestly describe what we see based on the words and ideas we have access to?
Right. Yeah.
I'm terrified that you've brought in the word honestly there.
It's a vague word. It's a vague idea. I don't necessarily mean authentically. I don't necessarily mean idealistically. Honesty is, to me, a value of which we always, as an individual, have to figure out what exactly the fuck it means.
When people qualify with an honestly, frankly, my dear, I always wonder when they're introducing that qualification of.
Oh no! Well, wait a minute.
It's my value. That's all.
You might as well use the word dishonestly, because that's exactly what you're talking about. Is that your system is also dishonest in dividing things in the wrong place. So therefore, go ahead and use the word dishonestly, because language by its very nature is dishonest. It's about systems and structure of how we position are the divisions.
Can I give a quote to that, please? He was Uman, a Chinese Zen master. He held up a staff and said, the Hinayanist, the average person calls this real existence. The Hinayanists say its nature is illusion. The Mahayanists call its nature is of emptiness. I call it a staff. What do you call it?
Yes. Yeah. So you can see in this discussion the way that we struggle when we try to describe organic order of the kind that the irrational, quote unquote, irrational mind produces, that gnosis produces, that nature produces all around us. When we try to model that using the preferences of mechanical order, of logic and reason and so forth, we get into trouble. Where is the line between red and orange? Or if we acknowledge that there's red-orange, where's the line between red and red-orange and orange?
Yeah.
Because the thing that mechanical order wants to do is divide everything into clean, tidy, pure, perfect parts with no confusion about which part is which, so that those perfectly defined parts can then be assembled into a machine. And if you can't do that, Verstand hates it, just breaks out in hives, just hates it. And what's interesting about organic order is that from the perspective of mechanical order, there's no such thing as organic order. Anything that's not mechanical order must ipso facto be chaos. And you see this kind of struggle of order against chaos in the way that we do law enforcement. In fact, our whole legal system and political system. You see it in Freud's discussion of the terrors of the id, and how it has to be chained up because, oh my God, it'll destroy everything. It's just nonsense. The concept that there could be alternative forms of order that do not obey the law of the excluded middle. They don't divide themselves into nice tidy parts that assemble into machines. They have ways of organizing that break all the rules of organization of mechanical order and yet are not chaos, and yet have their own systems of order in their own terms, in a way that mechanical order would hate, would not want to call order, but that nevertheless, in their own terms, are every bit as orderly, just not in the way we think of order. That challenge, can we reconceive of order versus chaos in such a way that we can comprehend the idea that what goes on in gnosis, what goes on in nature, in the deep structure of the world, is not in fact chaos, but neither is it mechanical order. But it's a different kind of order that doesn't obey clean boundaries, and yet at the same time doesn't dissolve into a muddle. It has structure, but not structure as Verstand understands it. This is one of the key challenges to us in understanding, according to Hegel and Smith, this is one of the key challenges in understanding our own mind, let alone the cosmos that we inhabit. Because they're arguing that evolution gave us two forms of orderliness to our thinking. And the Verstand is only that the noesis, which we usually only experience in its truncated form as Verstand, is only one of those two modes of order and thinking. The other mode of order and thinking, gnosis, is at least as important as noesis is. But its order doesn't work the same way at all and can't really be expressed in those terms.
To me, I heard a story in relationship to how describing gnosis as opposed to noesis, and which I really liked. And please, I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on it. Is that if, let's say, you met someone who was in the Witness Protection Program, you didn't know their name, you don't know all the facts that you learned about them is wrong, but you hung out with them every day, for like 6 months before they moved.
Yeah.
So you did not have a noetic understanding of them because everything you knew about them wasn't true. Right. But at the same time that you had a gnosis, a familiarity, I like that as in regards to the contrast of that type of feeling state of that type of connection that is not about facts.
Right. It's about something else, something that's really important to gnosis, but that's sort of inconceivable from the framework of noesis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
they
but
sort of,
you know, yeah,
Go ahead.
I'll give you Eisenhower's warning: beware the military-industrial complex.
yes.
However, the counter argument is like, if you don't have the military, how in the hell we're gonna dominate the rest of the world so we could provide you with the superior living that you're in? Do you want to fall back into the primitive shacks if that's what you want? Look, so in some sense, we are bought off. I mean, we kind of object, but we don't really truly object to the point that we really want the others to not be at least minimally colonialized. I mean, I don't want to go full-fledged domination, but I mean, I ask myself that question all the time. How much am I willing to really share and understand the world in the most open way possible? And I realize at the very bottom, at some point, I don't want to be totally equal either, because, well, I wouldn't be able to survive, at least to the degree that I'm sufficient to. So we're all bought off, even myself to a degree, right? Because if we really want to, we would truly revolt against the government that has provided us with this advantage. So beware the military industrial complex, but don't be so beware of it that you're going to eliminate our advantage in the world to that degree. We are just insufficiently human to actually accept the world as it could be. So there you are.
So I'm going to open that can of worms next time, not this
Okay.
time, because otherwise it will eat the entire discussion. It's too deep, man. You went too deep for today. I'd like to actually finish this thing that we've started unpacking,
Okay.
because otherwise we'll have to do it next time. So part of what we're unpacking is the idea that the oceanic feeling is not an oceanic feeling. It actually is a mode of thought that's concerned with forming wholes, with connecting us to the nature inside of us and the nature around us, as Heraclitus puts it, in such a way that we're sustainable. And we figure out what we need. We figure out what we need to be a part of, and we keep it all in mind at the same time, not as a machine, but as a whole thing. That's something that Gnosis can do and Noesis can't do. And the argument in doing this, one of the great challenges in trying to make this argument is that the core of the argument is that we need them both. That evolution gave us both faculties, not out of wastefulness, but because in human beings, at least, Gnosis and Noesis are each incomplete without the other. Each of them is solving part of the problem that requires the perspective that only it has, which is a perspective that's completely hidden from the other faculty. And it's when we use them in combination that we start to get insights into the world and start to be able to position ourselves.
Is there something wrong with a unicycle?
Right? What's wrong with a unicycle? I have a hammer, and by God, every problem is a nail, right? That's the modernist proposition is, if we're all just rational enough and we make enough rules and we create a giant world machine out of everything, obviously utopia will follow, right? What other outcome could there be? And as a result, if you start to peel back the modernist promise, and you start to seriously take seriously the prospect that each of these faculties has its own coherence and order and lawfulness. It's not just a flow of chaos. It has a lawfulness, but we're not in a position to understand that lawfulness because we spend our whole lives scapegoating it for every bad thing that ever happened in the world, because Verstand doesn't want to take responsibility for its own consequences. So death camps, warfare, genocide, slavery, you name it, anything that Verstand has created, it wants to blame on Gnosis and say the only form of Gnosis that's possible is primitive, irrational chaos. And therefore, don't you dare open that Don't you dare open that Pandora's box, or a world of evils will erupt and the whole world will collapse. This is Verstandt's argument.
I feel, in my opinion, sorry.
I'll call on you second, Peter, but Dale had his hand up first. So Dale and then Peter.
Okay. Next time, I'd like to introduce what Kahneman and his crew are thinking about this, because this sounds exactly like the differentiation between the default network and the cognitive mind. So
I would love that.
Compare that.
Yeah, please. Promise me you'll do that.
Okay.
Come next week and totally bring that. We'll talk about that.
Excellent.
I think that would be brilliant. Thank you. Peter, go ahead.
I just think one of the main obstacles in relationship to this idea of disorder and chaos and random is the lack of reflection of all often those terms are applied to our experience one way or another, simply because we do not yet see patterns that are beyond our current grasp. And
right.
So, it takes then a leap of faith in one form or another in order to explore it enough to potentially find patterns.
Right. And, it's part of why, to people who've been ultra intellectualized, like I was earlier in my life, one of the only ways that you can possibly get them to understand that there's something else in the mind is not to argue with them. That's hopeless. They've already built the perfect labyrinth. They're never coming out of it as long as they operate according to the terms they've predefined. But you can take them to the Grand Canyon and say, we're not going to say anything. I just want you to step out of the car, walk forward 40 feet, and just look. Because we are hardwired. We are hardwired with the capacity for gnosis. And it will respond to overwhelming peak experiences with that oceanic feeling that just erupts within us when something that there's no room for, as Horatio says, no room in your philosophy, Horatio. There's some things that go beyond it, and they can't be explained to you, but you can feel them. You can experience them. And then for a moment, your gnosis breaks free and shows you there's this whole other side to your mind and to your possibilities of how you can interact with the world. And it's the only way. It's the only way, right? But once that door has been opened, then you can start to talk to them about it. What was that? What did I feel? Why did I feel that? Why did that feel more important to me than everything I've done for the last 10 years at my job? Why do I have this longing? Why do I have this yearning? What the hell is this? Then you can have a conversation. But there's just no way to explain it in advance. It has to be felt. And in that way, it's like so many of the parts of life that gnosis specializes in. It's experiential. It's about the whole that gets formed between yourself as a body, what's going on inside of you, and what's going on around you. When you have a peak experience and all three of them align, you feel this oceanic feeling of completeness that can't be generated any other way, but that also can't be ignored because it's so potent.
I have great sympathy to that perspective. I have great sympathy. However, I am an appeal to words in regards to where beauty is for me, and that's what the experience of reading in a non-intellectual capacity. To me, I value what language can do to the mind.
So do I.
I know, but this idea of what it means for words to interrupt the Sisyphusian, cycle that people get into in regards to their own neuroanatomy, just finding that mode of profound stability and what it means to break through that so that their world can become a bit bigger. Nature can do that, in my opinion, far beyond than anything else, because that has been the oldest form of God. The stars, the Grand Canyon, all of this, when it comes down to how to move beyond the artificially contrived ideas and experiences of society when we go off into the wilderness. I just personally think that tends to be at this point for the few, because few people have access to it.
Right.
It's not, you
On
don't have the
purpose.
night sky anymore. I mean,
Right.
you can't see the galaxy, you know, of
Right.
the Milky Way that easily.
Right. Right. Which you know, by the way, is another example of that. The way that modernism attempts to suppress the oceanic feeling by creating a regularized, predictable, controllable experience of life and ensuring that everybody stays inside of that as much as possible.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to make a stable society if nobody's being overwhelmed by their connection with a larger cosmos at any moment.
Yeah,
it's just-
Rick,
Go
I
ahead,
like
Phil.
I like to interject a point to support you. It's clarify my idea of the loft a little bit better, because in a sense, that kind of peak experience you're talking about is always contextual. That
Yes.
means the relationship of things to each other as a
Yes.
whole. I mean, in some sense, so even if you took, you know, let's say you went down, you were foolish enough to think, well, I could actually capture the Grand Canyon. I'll just chip off a rock and take it home and stare at it. No, you don't get it. It's about the circular relationship of all those parts. And what happened with a room is it isolates you from seeing the whole. So
Right.
therefore, in our language, we have some capability of doing that, because a word by itself is not does not have any meaning either, let alone the letters. It's you have to read the paragraph. You have to, well, poetry is the better example. You have to see how the structure is created so it reflects from one line to another and they interact, not in a linear way, but they interact in a sense that you have the total experience of the not only the tree, but how it relates to the mountains and, you know, the cliffs and other things. So
Right.
therefore, in a sense, as an artist, I understand that concept. Now, how do you bring like a forest even into your loft, which is
Right.
more expensive than a room? I
Right.
mean, you have to experience the ring of meaning of relationship that exists. You know,
Yeah.
I think the South American language, that the Inca language that I guess the Aztec language that we destroy, is more complicated because it actually is a whole idea that's wrapped up within itself to a certain degree. And we have destroyed that, right? And not only destroyed that, but now we're actually competing between like that and, you know, like the alphabetic language to let's say Chinese, which is at least honors a single thing as a thing, and we want to segment that even more so it becomes more efficient in the sense, you know, like, have you ever seen a Chinese typewriter? I mean, the computer have transformed a Chinese typewriter. Like, let me just write it. I mean, it's a lot simpler
A lot
than
easier.
creating on a typewriter because it's so inefficient. Oh my God, it's
Yes.
like so complicated. So therefore, in a sense, if you can't translate it into a system, it in a sense, well, it's not efficient enough for us to produce what is needed. So in
Yes.
that sense, we have destroyed this sort of contextualization of language that makes it more difficult to contextualize. And so therefore, in a sense, inefficient. So I think you really pin on a very important thing. It depends on a circle of things that interact and relate to each other at that moment. And sometimes even when you return in a different day with a different light, it might not have the same effect. So
Yes.
we need to understand that in some sense, it almost cannot be translated into a universality because the moment captures itself in a certain context that's important.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and I gotta be careful here with my use of the word nature because in a modernist sense, nature only applies to the things we haven't paved over yet. But in the Heraclitean sense, everything is part of nature, even if we don't comprehend it. And so there's nature, as he says, within us as well. So our character is a kind of nature, and our feelings are a kind of nature. And although Verstand wants to dismiss them all as being just irrational, murky chaos, it has its own lawfulness, which is every bit as binding as anything we've ever written a mathematical equation for. It's just that because we can't write a mathematical equation for it, we think that it's not lawful. We don't have a way of representing clearly enough for ourselves to grok that there's actual order involved of its own kind. And so it confuses us, and we shy away. So part of what we're trying to get at here is this idea that there is this excluded other in modernism, which is entirely half of our experience of life, that we were evolved to incorporate as part of a whole. We evolved in order to bring together the experience of life and the analysis of life into what Hegel calls a third mental faculty. That is what adulthood would look like for human beings in a culture. But because we're in a dysculture, and this goes beyond Hegel's critique, because he couldn't quite turn and face his own civilization and its deficits. Later people did this analysis. Because of the structure of modernism, it reduces us down to the two infantile basal metabolic structures of the mind, to gnosis in a finitized form as Begriff, noesis in a finitized form as Verstand, so that they're easier to keep in all the separate rooms, using Phil's metaphor, so that they obey in a more predictable fashion. Because the adult mind is far less predictable and far more powerful and disruptive. It can create order, it can create healthy order, but it can also shatter unhealthy order, because the combination of the longing for healthfulness and connectedness put together with the powers of analysis make it an enemy of unhealthy order. And so when you're in favor of order for order's own sake, as modernism is, you hate the idea that the order that you've constructed, even if it's killing people, you hate the idea that it will be damaged, because you have conflicts of interest. You have vested interests. You have billions of dollars tied up in the way things go now. And in order to change the way things are, you would have to lose an enormous amount of money. And money is the only metric of value that you recognize. And therefore, the concept of destroying unhealthy order and replacing it with healthier order is anathema, because it would destroy your current vested interests. And so you get this war going on. This is what Kenneth Smith talks about, the characterological war in modernism to exterminate Vernunft and prevent the arising of heuristic personalities, so that nobody has the capacity to really understand or grapple with the system as it is and try to improve it. We're only allowed to work within the system. We're not allowed to seriously challenge the things that it does wrong. And that is at the very central core of what makes modernism what it is. When we peel away all the self-praise, modernism loves to praise itself. It is the most self-aware, in the sense of self-flattering, epoch of history we've ever seen. It's never been the case that the entire world was united in saying everybody else sucked. For all of history, they were all awful, primitive versions of ourselves. Only we have it right. And we will march on to a glorious Star Trek future. This kind of massive inflation of the ego that's associated, it goes hand in hand with modernism's determination to exterminate. Although we don't think of it in these terms, we aren't taught it in elementary school, we don't brag about it in our speeches, we don't brag about it in the newspapers, we never want to say it. It's part of the nescience that we're not allowed to examine. But modernism is more antagonistic to the development of the adult personality that combines gnosis and noesis than any epoch in the history of the world. Nobody was ever this clear about how to industrially manufacture human beings and societies in order to get them productive and profitable. Nobody ever had this much control.
Hence my shock when I read the Communist Manifesto just superficially.
Yeah.
I was shocked how infantile it was.
Oh yeah.
And it even had the word proletariat in it. You know, the ancient Romans or Greeks called most of their population the children.
Yeah.
And yeah, the whole communist system seems to have an outlook: be a kid forever, never take any responsibility, just stay in that bubble, obey the state.
Yet certainly communism in any form that has existed so far under modernism is another symptom of modernism. I mean, we can call it communism all we like, but it's not possible for a modern to fully understand their own circumstances and their own society, and that goes for its rebels as well. And it's why in the mid 20th century you got this Chomskyite critique of all existing forms of communism, which was that these socialist countries were still authoritarian, still trying to stamp out any actual rebels arising, still very systematic, Verstand, hyper-organized, that just did it a different way. And that Chomsky's line is that they were two sides of the same coin that needed each other and propped each other up as the enemy that justified the centralization, the expenditures on the military, all of the totalitarian qualities that they share in common with each other. Whatever it is that's supposed to come after modernism, if we were to develop in a healthy way as an organism, as a species, it's almost impossible for us to figure out what that would be right now, because we ourselves are moderns. And so we have all the assumptions and worldviews of a modern. And our attempt to paint a postmodern picture is just going to be some other variant of modernism, maybe far worse.
I kind of want to explore a bit of a disagreement, because I feel like, that however the legitimacy of all of these issues of modernity, I feel like this is one point of which you made mention, which has happened plenty of times before, is when society becomes so complex and convoluted that no single individual can understand the interworkings of it. Say when legal systems become that complex and it requires some very heady specializations in order to understand anything of the depth of even one small part of it. I mean, that tends to be right before there's some type of profound simplistic movement or collapse of some kind.
Right.
I think that we're honestly, in my opinion, I don't mean to oversimplify, but I do see it as a kind of the fall of their own kind of situation over a period of the next few decades. Because we can't maintain this level of complexity in order for the next generation to maintain this level of upholding the systems that are, because it's just too far beyond in order for it to continue on from generation to generation as it currently is. However, I do think that despite, let's say, the lower quality of connection to nature because of modernism, because of capitalism, I still do think, and I don't mean this in an idealistic sense, but for a naive sense, because I do believe that at this time, for the individual, this is the golden age of getting access towards, the world's knowledge while it still is maintainable in regards to, the internet is a super complex and in some ways unstable entity that currently exists.
Right.
So when it comes down to the individual development, there's never been a more golden time, I personally believe, in relationship to the potential the individual can do in relationship to their own enlightenment and development. Whether or not we know how to navigate these far more complex mazes than ever did before, and how more detached we are from the little hard reality of toiling the ground.
Where did you get the strange idea that you want to develop?
Well, I'm talking
Whose
about
idea was that?
Well, I'm talking about
you fell out of the tree when you were born, and you've got this great idea. I want to develop. You sure it's your idea?
It's mine now.
It's yours now, but it wasn't originally.
Nothing was.
Okay.
What ideas are my own?
Wait. Wait, Stephen, are you saying everything existed before and we just discovered it and we can't come up with anything new?
Oh, well, yeah, largely, yes. We are mere creations of the universe or God or whatever else you like to call it. And that thing is bigger than us.
I highly doubt I've done anything completely original.
We are just creatures. We're little things running around.
I value my.
And stay in your bubble, because if you ever discover the fact that you're actually only meat, it's a painful experience.
I don't see it that way.
Is artificial intelligence only transistors?
There is no such thing presently as artificial intelligence.
If you say so.
When I can say to my computer, work it out all for me, dude, I'm just going to bed, then I believe there's artificial intelligence.
Cool.
So obviously, what part of what's interesting about these discussions is that they open enormous cans of worms. They lead to things. It's one of Kenneth Smith's core parts of his philosophy is that he doesn't like to just philosophize in a little room with a clean, coherent system that makes sense in its own self, as long as you don't contaminate it with reality. He always wants to bring these things out into the world and say, what does the world have to say about this? What does this have to say about the world? And as a result, anytime we get into one of these essays, they immediately point us outward as well as inward into all these very interesting and very juicy topics. But our problem is it points to more topics than we have time to get to. It's currently 1:26. We've got just over a half hour left to do. I think we can finish this one paragraph before our 3 hours are up. But first I'm going to call on Phil, who's got his hand up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to bring up an artist that really fits into what we're talking about. That's Jasper Johns. Jasper Johns, along with Rauschenberg, was the next generation of artists that came after the abstract expressionists. The abstract expressionists actually had a commitment and a belief, at least certain ones of them, that believe that one's own mark making is, in a sense, an expression of something greater through one's, I guess, one spirit that's connected to something more. And what Jasper Johns in particular did, and he, by the way, he was a hero of mine, he still is that he began to paint in such a way, this is the wrong one, but he began to paint a way in which the mark making was merely a part of a language as it invented. It didn't embody anything that's sort of spiritual. He was more interested in demythicizing the spirituality, the structure that encapsulate like the not the ego, but the spirit and the soul. Okay, so he was very, very important, you know, and 2019, and probably a couple of years before that, he ran into a photograph of a friend of his that who had a friend who died, and apparently he was this friend was very, very moved and sad by that, by the emotions and all that kind of stuff. And he, I think his friend also became, he also passed away or something. So he found this thing in a 1-bedroom apartment that was all wrinkled up. And apparently it had something to do with how he was feeling at the moment and how that moved him. And he said to himself, you know, it's too damn bad that we have lost this sense of sentiment in art, you know. Although he has spent his whole life fleshing that out, his art was more about irony than anything else.
Yes.
And so he made some sketches based on this wrinkled up photograph, and he abstracted it and worked with it, and he was producing this all at the same time when he was lamenting how we have lost this connection to a deeper emotion that he had fleshed out to create just a mere language of variations. Okay, so he's creating the variations. So it was interesting that he had that thought. Instead of changing to painting in a more emotional way that's connected, he continued to use his method of deconstructing and creating a synthetic picture that's based on this photograph that had moved his friend so much, I think his friend might have committed suicide at the same time, that he felt that there was something missing in art, at least in his art, but nonetheless, he continued doing it.
Right.
Very, very interesting. That painting is something he worked on in 2019, so very recently. So I was surprised that he was still alive, but nonetheless, that was an interesting story, how we get caught up in this, this cage in which we can't get out of, even though we recognize that it's deficiencies, but because you spend your whole life promoting and fleshing out the spirit, it's like to suddenly renounce it and revert to something else, I guess is something that he wasn't capable of doing or want to do. Very, very interesting concept. Like I said, he was a very, very important artist that followed and in a sense dismissed the abstract expressionists in some sense.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Jasper Johns.
If you, I'll look more at that because I didn't know that phase of Jasper Johns' work. The paintings that they have on Wikipedia, plus a few others, were the sum total of my exposure to his work.
Well, probably not because this was a 2019 painting and he made some comments about the background, but he continues to transform it, which is like, you see something, you're not inspired by its connectedness to the emotion. It's just another object that you could deconstruct and reconstruct and produce an appearance of something that in some sense that has a language and a validity in the art itself. So I just want to bring that up. 2019 painting.
Thank you. I'll look for that. Yeah, that's definitely long after my art education. So, part of the challenge with criticizing modernism is that moderns hate criticism, and we hate criticism of modernism more than we hate anything else. You're not allowed to. Modernism is allowed to dismiss everything before it as some kind of gross caveman caricature of life. But despite the fact that it's happy to wildly distort the past, it insists that you accurately describe every virtue of modernism anytime you want to bring up even one vice. And that's because we're so allergic to it. And we don't realize how allergic we are to it because we're surrounded by the rah, go team stuff so much that we take that for normal. So, of course, modernism has done amazing things for human progress. Of course it has. And, there are things that we do with medicine now that are just amazing. I mean, and there are things that we do, firing rockets into space. As far as we know, nobody ever did that before. We can spend all day extolling our virtues, and we do. That's pretty much what it means to be a modern, is just endlessly patting yourself on the head.
Well, what I meant to say by that story.
I'm not responding to you, Phil. I'm not.
Okay. No, but I want to add to it. What I was saying was that, in a sense, habituation makes it difficult to get out of the habit.
Yes. That it's a hard habit to break, and we don't even know that we're doing it. But it's something I've been working on for a few decades. I've been trying anytime that I feel pressure from within myself, not to critique some part of who I am and where I'm living. I pay attention to that, and I try to swim right at that current and try to figure out, why am I not supposed to do this? What is it that we're not supposed to investigate here? So when I go at modernism, the trick is to understand that the way I'm going at modernism is the way that Hegel talked about his dialectic. He rejected the terms thesis, antithesis, and synthesis because he said they're too Kantian, they're too intellectual and arbitrary. They're based on the idea that anything could be set up in opposition to any other thing, and that you could synthesize them together into a third thing, and voila, you win. And he says that's not how nature works at all. The way that nature really works is that the bud develops into the blossom through the opposition of the forces that want it to open up when what the bud wants to do is stay closed.
Sorry, which philosopher was this?
Hegel.
Hegel, right. Yeah, okay.
Right. So that the blossom opening up and making itself fragile and exposed to the world is doing everything that is the opposite of what the bud is doing when it's trying to be enclosed and protect itself against the ice of winter. And if the bud could have its way, there would be no more plants ever. Because if that flower doesn't, there'd be no more flowering plants. Because if that bud doesn't open, it's never going to get fertilized, and there's never going to be the possibility of developing beyond that into the fruit. And that the same thing is true of the relationship between the blossom and the fruit. That if the blossom could stay a blossom forever and never develop into anything else and just be the perfect blossom, again, it would be the end of all life for flowering plants, because it has to transform to become the fruit. And that the nature of these transformations is not an intellectual exercise, but rather it is the inherent lawfulness of each of these stages, that it exists not only for its own sake, to maximize what it is now, but also to transform into something so alien from itself that if it had a will, it would choose to resist and say, that's everything I'm against. You can't possibly do that. And yet, at the same time that those oppositions are happening, Hegel says, the deeper truth is that there is an incorporation of the strengths of the previous stage into the next stage in such a way that it is not just preserved intact like a museum replica, but is fulfilled in a way that it can't be if it could hold still the way that it wants to hold, the way that it would imagine it wants to hold still. And that when we talk about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit in this sense, and then apply that to the structure of the development of the mind and the structure of the development of civilizations, what we can see is that the reason for criticizing modernism is not so that we can say that some other phase was the right phase that we should all go back to and then stay there in a static way forever. That's what mechanical order imagines to be opposition. But what dialectical or organic order understands to be opposition is that we critique the things in order to understand what our future growth is going to be. What is it that we're going to incorporate? What is it that we have to overcome? How is it that the things that we have to overcome are holding back the fulfillment of the potential of the thing we already have? And this is why I critique modernism, and why Kenneth Smith does it and why Hegel does it the way that they do it is not to say modernism's stupid, but it's bad and we should go do thing X. But in order to
historically, that was the interesting thing, that there was this pushback against the mechanistic outlook.
Yes.
And it was quite strong in the 70s, the little books about it on every newsstand, but today, bang, suddenly in the 80s,
yes,
the Verstehen fought back. The Verstehen struck back and came back with enormous force.
Yes.
I mean, there's people running around today that wouldn't understand the slightest thing beyond the mechanistic view of the universe.
Right. That's what they've got, and that's what they want to stick with, and that's the way it's going to be if they have their way. But what they don't understand is Heraclitus called this out 2,500 years ago. If people got exactly what they wanted, it would be a disaster, because our wants are wrong. We're drawn towards wanting to keep the bud enclosed. We're drawn towards thinking the way we are now is the way we're supposed to be, and our job is to protect it as a pure, perfect museum replica, failing to understand that that's death. And not death in the rich, natural sense, but death in the sterility sense, the end of all things. So this is where you can see this difference between how Hegel is describing the dialectic and the tensions and transformations over time. If you compare that to how Freud is envisioning the mind, Freud is using a mechanical structure of order in which the mind is a steam engine, and the purpose of it is to be subordinate to the ego, and the purpose of ego is to be subordinate to superego, and they each have their job to play, and they have to stay inside their lines. And if everybody does that, then the machine will keep functioning, right? The dirty, dark-skinned id is primitive, scary, full of chaos, is supposed to stay down in the boiler room and shovel coal so that the ego can do its more noble job. This is Freud's, vision, his colonialist vision of the structure of the mind. He can't imagine a mind in which what he thinks is supposed to be the laborers and the source of energy is actually the source of meaning that gives noesis the context to make sense of the world, to keep it from straying off into the 99 rationally consistent, coherent, logically beautiful, but completely false, valid proposition that it could reach as conclusions if it didn't have the leash to reality to guide it back to, well, those are all pretty, but can we talk about what you're actually, the tiger that's bearing down on you right now that maybe you should pay attention to. There's this capacity of gnosis to draw you back into the larger whole so that your noetic investigations can have a context that makes them fruitful. Is anathema from the Verstand perspective, because Verstand thinks it's the end of history. It's arrived. We're there. We're done. Now that we're all Vulcans and we all follow systems, we can just stop. And that's where things are supposed to be. So when he talks about Aufgehoben in this second sentence of this paragraph, what he's doing is invoking the science of logic in Hegel and by extension, the phenomenology of Geist. He's talking about the dialectic. And he's talking about the organic relationships between things that grow up through these processes of opposition and incorporation. And Aufgehoben is part of a group of three terms that Hegel uses to talk about this. The first term, Aufheben, which we translate as to sublate, this is him attempting to create a verb out of an ordinary German word. He's trying to create a philosophical verb that means the process of two things that are in opposition being incorporated into each other to form a new third whole. And not in an arbitrary mathematical way as Kant's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but in an organic way in terms of stages of development, in which by doing this, you fulfill the teleology that was already present in the things that were in opposition against each other. It's a complex concept only from the perspective of the mechanistic mind. Because for the mechanistic mind, there are clean boundaries between things. And this interpenetration and merging, and the idea that two separate things in two separate frames could actually be the same thing at different stages of development, there's no space for that in a machine. Machines don't grow. They don't flow. They don't transform. They aren't othering. So what we're seeing here in this opening paragraph is a juxtaposition of two fundamentally alien worldviews, the worldview of noesis and the worldview of gnosis, and trying to see the relationship between them. Yes. So if Aufheben is the verb to sublate, i.e. to do this dialectical transformation, then Aufhebung is the noun, sublation, for the process of doing this transformation. The fact that it exists in nature, everywhere we look, every cell in our bodies is doing it all the time. This is like part of the fundamental engine of life, and it can't be represented with any fidelity within a Verstand context. Our modernist civilization is based upon suppressing this idea and seeing things as resources. The idea that food is fuel and the body is a machine is a perfect example of the ways in which Verstand wants to reduce everything down to tiny moving parts. And it completely misunderstands the idea that there's more to food than calories. You literally rebuild yourself from the food. It's not just fuel going into a tank and being burned. It is literally the car rebuilding itself from what it has consumed, which no car will ever do, because cars are structured according to mechanical order, which Verstand understands. They're not organized according to organic order, which Gnosis can understand, right? So what we're seeing captured here in this opening, this opening couple of sentences is this attempt to invoke this organic transformative picture of life. And in that picture of life, and finally, this is the punchline. This is what I've been getting wrong about Kenneth Smith's juxtaposition of spirit and soul since the beginning. He says, in spiritual experiences, this order, the order that we were discussing, is aufgehoben. Aufgehoben is the third noun. It's the noun which stands in for the things that have been incorporated into the new whole. They have, on the one hand, been negated because they were not allowed to stay the way they were. They've, on the other hand, been incorporated and accepted because they've been brought forward into the new format. But really, the truth is that they have unfolded new order. will they or nil they, into a new greater whole. That's what he's saying about Aufgehoben. And the only way that that could be true of spiritual experiences is if everything that I said, trying to equate Verstand to spirit, was wrong in the previous weeks. I've had that wrong this whole time. When he's talking about spirit, he's not talking about Verstand, he's talking about Vernunft. He's talking about the place where the dialectic fulfills itself by pulling together gnosis and noesis out of the finitized limited forms of Begriff and Verstand into a new whole that unfolds new order and is capable of doing things inconceivable from the perspective of Begriff or Verstand. That's what Kenneth Smith is talking about by spirit here. So my apologies to you guys for the last several months for attempting to do a direct equation. It's partly because of the fuzziness of the language, how difficult it can be to read exactly what's going on. But he's basically saying that gnosis by itself keeps you trapped in a soulish mode. Gnosis augmented by noesis, with the two of them working together, can rise up into a kind of consciousness, a superliminal awareness of yourself, in which you can preserve the strengths of a soulish experience, but put them in motion to transform yourself and the world. It's not an equation with Verstand. Spirit and Verstand, he is not equating. I had that completely dead wrong. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, this leads me to ask a question about Heidegger. I began reading Heidegger because there's a meetup that's coming up. I thought it was this week, but it turns out it was later. And in it, he says that man is driven by his destiny, and the destiny is not just a kind of like how should I say, a determined thing.
Yeah.
It's more like man is rowing a boat into his future. You could translate that into his fate or destiny. But the part that so man is therefore doing work to unfold this destiny that's happening, okay? Because he is existing in a process of unfolding being. But there was a statement that he made that puzzled me. He says, this effort is to create a clearing of being, the clearing of being. And I wonder why he used that phrase, clearing off being, rather than the clearing for being. Because off being is as if like being is going to unfold in a sense like, oh, lucky there's a clearing that happened. Now I could blossom forth and unfold myself into something that, let's say, we could comprehend.
Right.
Using the word clearing for being means that mankind must participate in the process of providing the clearing for being to open up. So why did he use the word off being rather than for being? Right. It's like, because if being is going to unfold itself, I could just sit back and just sort of wait for being to unfold my destiny.
Right.
Right. Rather than me rowing the damn boat, making all that damn effort.
Yes.
So like, I didn't need to do that, but I do row the boat to provide the clearing. And so did he just, unfortunately, was sloppy in the language? Was there something wrong in the translation? Or did he meant something that deeper than I think, that is going to happen anyway? You just think you're rowing the boat. Right. Because like I said, I might as well just sit back and wait for being to unfold.
And why not?
Well, you know, the act of sitting back engages with your being in a way that will produce one set of results. And the act of actively rowing engages with your being in a different way that will produce a different set of results. It's the complicated way in which our situation and our intentions and our actions interact together to create really difficult to predict complex results.
Yeah, so but he made such an effort to talk about rowing the boat.
Yeah.
It's like the oars repeating itself. Like he must mean that we somehow have some play in our destiny, in our fate. The fate doesn't just happen, right? But then he switched it to off rather than for, that we somehow didn't help in this process, right? Which is confusing to me. I mean, like, why? I mean, he makes such an effort that you do participate,
Yes.
right? He couldn't have said, he could have said, you're sailing down the river and suddenly being opens up. How damn lucky, how damn lucky. Oh, my fate was determined all along when I got into the boat, into the river.
Can I do a small Zenism? I forget the name of the masters of associate, but the dialogue goes as this. A student was able to leave his master's hermitage, and the master said, "Where are you going?" And the student said, "To an unchanging place." And the master said, if it's unchanging, how can there be any going? And
Right.
the student said, "The going is also unchanging."
Nice. Nice.
It's the false dichotomy between active and passive.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Thank you, Peter. Right on. I'm a big fan of Zen koans, and that one's a doozy. Yeah. There's some sense in which if when you arrive at the deepest truths, it doesn't involve a paradox that just blows your mind, you probably haven't got there yet, because nature seems to thrive on paradox, and never on just never a trivial contradiction, but always something that can't be comprehended from a one limited perspective. You have to come at it from multiple angles until you could sort of decode the paradox and go, well, it's still a paradox, but at least now I know why it's a paradox. How the relationship between action and inaction, between being and not being, through becoming, all this stuff, right? So, Sharon, this entire session was my homage to you and my apology, because some weeks ago, you asked about soul and spirit and ego, and you actually said, is he saying that Begriff is like the soulish side and Verstand is the ego side and Vernunft is the spirit? And I said, oh no, that's not it at all. It's totally that, that Gnosis is soul and Noesis is spirit, and so Verstand is more spirited than Begriff. And boy, was I wrong. This sentence and the rest of the paragraph here just proves that you were right and I had this wrong.
Okay. Because that word, I had it outlined, Offenboen, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm saying it all wrong. And what it meant to me was active participation.
Yes.
Right? Yes. Members are of an audience who are actively participating. And so that meant, I tried to interpret that as conscious, subconscious, which one of those character types we talked about. And actually I got lost in it. So the discussion today was pretty elucidating, particularly when you broke it down into the 3 subtypes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. I'm glad that was helpful. Yeah, yeah. I had to spend a lot of time combing through how did I arrive at the previous conclusions and how did I miss this? But it's the temptation in a Verstand-based civilization in which everything is supposed to obey the law of the excluded middle makes it a reflex to see things in binary terms, even when they're absolutely not. And the idea that spirit was not in binary opposition to soul, but rather was a fulfillment of soul.
Yeah.
Once intellect and ego have been incorporated into it in a whole, that I missed it for so long.
Well, how come you didn't fall into the habitual addiction that Jasper John fell into?
I felt a current pushing against me, and I said, I must swim upriver at once. my home must be up there somewhere.
Okay. What I didn't hear you all talk about today, though, was how these new definitions manifested themselves in works of art, whether it's canvas or music. And I guess that's what this whole session of this whole subsection of Kenneth Smith was alluding to.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, instead of soulish versus spiritual art, the thing we most often want to talk about is soulish versus egotistical art.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
That was where that was what was my point of questioning, confusion. Right.
Yeah, we're right to be confused because I had it wrong.
Yeah, well, this sounds more correct because I always thought the soul was an enigma that it's difficult for it to surface and needs help. It needs some assistant, a helping hand to make it appear in the world. And
Yes.
and that seems to make a lot more sense that they were oppositional. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, and this idea that if you, as we all do, find yourself in media res, and you've already been acculturated into egotism and intellect and systematic thinking, then if you go searching for the soulish dimension of life and of your inner life in your art, and you try to find it and incorporate it, that the result of incorporating the soulishness into what you already have isn't going to be soulishness per se, but is going to be spirit, because it's been
Yes. Yes.
right to a level that can be conscious. It remains soulish as long as it isn't conscious. All that stuff under the water that's going on is soulish. But when we transform the conscious part of ourselves to begin to illuminate those hidden depths, then we're engaging in a spiritual activity.
Yeah, but I think this engagement allow you to sense a connection to the soul, though. I mean, so it's not like totally separated, you know.
Exactly.
That's why I use the metaphor. You know, my fallen angels are like inside out, right? It exposes it, but it's still the inside that I want you to see, rather than the outside, right? But it needs help, otherwise it remains inside and hidden.
The finger pointing to the moon remains finite, but it is at least pointing to the infinite.
So does the ego subtend the spirit, or the spirit subtends the ego? Which is that?
Well, according to this sentence, which I think is a better representation of Kenneth Smith and Hegel than anything I've done today, which makes sense because it's his own words. It would say that what's happening is that soul and ego both become aufgehoben. They both become incorporated into
participants, yes,
the spirit. And that's what creates the spirit. You can't have spirit unless you're pulling these things together into this new blossoming.
Now that makes absolute sense, and it certainly helps explain those first 4 or 5 sentences of that paragraph, which is really the essence of this whole section.
Yeah,
I think what happens is that when you have a relationship between the ego and the spirit, what happens is the spirit steals it away for its own use, and that's why I try to draw that distinction between Wagner and Mahler, right? In other words, the wrong connection, it in a sense is stealing it to shine a light on itself rather than shine a light on the depths.
Right. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just wondering, my great belief about us all is that we're just ape creatures and we're just looking for that next banana.
Yes.
And I think all the grand structures and arts and all are all just games which are which the ambition is to get more bananas.
Yes.
So why all the elaborate mental structure and things like conscious mind and all that, you know?
Yes.
Shouldn't we just stick to looking for bananas and getting that next banana?
So, you know, the challenge for us out of evolution is that evolution played a trick on us, right? It gave us this greater freedom of action that includes an enormous number of possible disasters. So we can do things other animals can't because their instincts drive them in the direction of the banana. And if we're using our faculties that evolution cursed / gifted us with correctly, we too should be able to get bananas. But the problem is that's only one out of 100 paths. Many of the other paths are let's go over that cliff or walk into that lion's mouth because I have a theory that says that it will lead to my apotheosis. I mean, what you're saying is right on the money in the sense that, you know, the combination of trying to compensate for the missing instincts through this combination of Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft is a really delicate and error-prone operation in us. As we can see when we look at history, it is very easy to go the wrong way and mess things up.
The more evolved, I think, engage in a higher process of differentiation. Yes, we're all looking for bananas, right, as Stephen puts it, but the more evolved engage in a more developed process of differentiation of the many paths of life, as you're saying.
Yes. Now there's I think it's a Zen koan, it might be a martial arts saying that I think reinforces what Stephen's saying here, which is that, you know, before enlightenment, you scrub floors, carry water, and chop wood. But after enlightenment, you scrub floors, carry water, and chop wood.
Said that in the 1800s.
Who said that?
1800s. Layman Peng. He was a Chan master of 800 of AD.
Yes. And that underscores what Stephen is saying, is that, you know, people in search of enlightenment often imagine that the result of enlightenment will be that you don't have to look for bananas anymore. But the Zen master rightly points out that no, you still need the banana. You're still going to have to do the work and get the bananas. Your relationship to what you're doing and why you're doing it has changed if you've gone through this process correctly. But it's not going to transubstantiate us out of our material plane.
Well, the problem with the banana is that it distracts you from like a deeper search for the soul, the human soul, and at least in this case. And I think quite often people are bought off. Wouldn't you rather have a banana instead, right? I mean, I think, I don't know what it is. Not that I hate bananas. I don't. I actually like bananas. But somehow I'm not as easily bought off by one banana, 2 banana, 3 banana, 4. I mean, I don't know what it is. I seem to be more fixated in something that's, you know, I hate to say higher, but Stephen is going to criticize me for saying that. Something different.
You hear it coming, don't you? You can hear him typing right now, can't you?
Right.
Oh, Phil, let me tell you about the banana. Right. So I tell you what, next week, right, Dale's going to bring this other philosophical work that bears right on what we've been talking about. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about more of this because we only just got here at the end of 3 hours. So we're gonna explore where this leads us, because we read this differently when we see this relationship between soul and ego and spirit. And I will address Stephen's question about why would we talk about soul and ego and spirit? Do we even need those to go get our bananas? And because I think that's a really interesting question. As was it Dale who or was it someone else who said in the comments that one of the great things about Stephen's contributions in these discussions is he loves to chuck a rock through a window, and they're often windows in desperate need of a rock. That somebody needs to say, you know, that window you're worshiping, it is in fact just a window. It's not the world, and it's not showing you things that are truly there. So we will dig into this, and this also frankly goes to what Sharon has been asking for since the beginning: is what is the practical point? This Stephen agree about this. I should add, what is the practical point of this discussion of soul and ego and spirit, of this philosophy, when, you know, in fact, we do need to eat our bananas.
That's right.
So we'll get into that. But thank you for indulging me. I know we spent an enormous amount of time on a handful of sentences, but I was hoping partly to apologize, partly to make amends, but partly also because I was so surprised by all the interesting stuff I found in here when I finally read it the right way. It's just classic Kenneth Smith that in a handful of sentences, He's basically drawing on thousands of years of philosophy and pitting them against each other to try to illuminate the human condition.
So
well, the fascinating thing for me as a non-philosopher is to hear the breadth and depth and width of the different people in the group.
It's a great.
Did you need the extra 15 minutes to? Did you need the extra 15 minutes to prepare for this, or was the 15 extra minute devoted to something else?
Honestly, I thought I'd prepped for this already, and I'm sitting in the car at the vet while they're doing the inspection on my cat to make sure she's okay.
Okay.
I'm reading this essay again, and I said, Alphabum. Why didn't I follow that up to see what he's talking about there? And once I started looking, I'm like, oh no.
Yeah.
Everything's hiding in here.
Yes, yes, yes.
So there's a philosopher, an architect, Paolo Soleri. He put out, speaking of the 70s, he put out some books called, his main one's called Arcology. And his ideas have been very popular. You see him in science fiction films, was based on the idea that rather than building a bunch of separate buildings and putting them together and calling them a city, we should build giant superstructures, three-dimensional cities with parks up in the air and so forth. And that if we did that, we wouldn't have to sprawl over the planet and suffocate it. We would leave room for wilderness and farms and things. And before he starts, he does these incredible architectural drawings. They're unbelievable. He was a master draftsman. Arcology. I'll put it in the chat. Arcology. And everybody reads that part because they want to look at the pictures. He's building cities that span canyons. He's building cities that are underwater or floating on the surface. He builds all these crazy three-dimensional structures. But the part that everybody skips over, it turned out to be the part that I love the most. He has all these hand drawings in the beginning where he's talking about his philosophy of arcology. And one of the things that's at the core is this idea of concentration minimalism. He says the reason we have the human mind with the structure it does is because we need to be able to shrink the world down enough to fit it in a close enough space to be able to compare things that are far apart and as though they were together. And if we can do that, then we can predict the future better than if we can't do that. A jellyfish can't.
I'm in favor of anything that brings me more bananas.
Right? He says it'll bring you more bananas. And so he said people fail to understand this aspect of the human mind. Miniaturization and concentration are an enormous part of it, that we can take these pictures of giant things from across the world and shrink them down and fit them in the same space and go, Everest or Rainier? Everest or Rainier? We can start to ask questions that no being would normally ask because they could only be in one place at a time. So I see that going on in Kenneth Smith's writing style, this miniaturization where he pulls whole other branches of philosophy together and puts them in the same sentence and says, well, what would Hegel and Freud and Heraclitus have to say to each other about this topic? And it blows my mind that even knowing that for 20 years, I can read right past it and miss it and then come back and go, it's right there in one sentence is the whole thing, just waiting to be unpacked.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.